Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to another evening of great decisions. As you know, the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg has partnered with the Frederickson Library to organize this series of discussions on the most pressing issues facing our world today and our local communities as well. And tonight's topic is right at the top, climate change. And we are absolutely privileged to have in our region one of the world's most acclaimed thinkers on the issue of climate change. And I'll give him a more in-depth introduction after we see the video. But Don Brown is renowned throughout the world for the groundbreaking work he's done connecting morality and climate change. But now I also want to welcome you to just sit back while we watch our video, and also to remind you that the World Affairs Council has embarked on a public health initiative. We are encouraging and helping anyone who wants to get a vaccine or a booster, and you don't have a way to do it, you don't have a way to get there, contact us, we'll make it happen. And if you have an organization that you would like us to help sponsor a vaccination clinic, we can help with that as well. So please reach out, walkharrisburg@gmail.com, and we will help you in any way we can, because we are for keeping our communities healthy and safe. So with that, I am going to ask Zach, who's working behind the scenes, to start our video. And when it ends, I'll come back and give a better introduction to Don Brown.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. The third topic in this masterclass is climate change. I've been delivering Great Decisions lectures since 1987. Back then, the Soviet Union was a perennial topic. It made its way into every Great Decision series until the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the USSR. I've seen over the course of these last 3 decades a number of topics considered on a biannual or triannual basis, and others still, like outer space this year, considered in what seems like a one-off scenario. Climate change appeared to be somewhere in between those two extremes, until the Foreign Policy Association chose it for each of the past 3 years. That signals to us that climate change is increasingly a concern for American foreign policy makers and the citizens of our great democracy. We begin with something of a caveat. Climate change is not about the weather. The weather is a short-term phenomenon that varies greatly from one day to the next. We learn about the weather forecast on the world's most popular app. Climate, however, is about long-term discernible trends. They unfold over the course of decades, generations, or even centuries. Before we can consider U.S. foreign policy options as it relates to climate change, there are 3 main considerations: the impact of climate change, global efforts to address it, and finally, the role of the United States. We begin with the question of impact. Climate change affects every aspect of our lives, including our own health and safety. Human migration, domestically and abroad, increasingly impacted by changes in the climate. Conflicts are happening more frequently abroad, according to the Pentagon, and the same study tells us that those conflicts are likely to draw American troops into them. And then finally, climate change impacts our pocketbooks. We can feel it personally, the costs associated with climate change. Consider at the aggregate level how much our nation spends on extreme weather. From 1970 until 2019, we spent $3.4 trillion on extreme weather events, for an annual average of $69 billion. In 2020 alone, the United States set a record with a $100 billion extreme weather expense. And then in 2021, Texas alone, the freeze cost between $100 and $130 billion. But we don't have to look at the aggregate numbers for the nation. We can simply open up our own home insurance policy renewal notices. If you live on the eastern seaboard especially, even more so for those of us in Hurricane Alley in South Florida, the cost of home insurance has been skyrocketing 20 and 30% year on year, and that is because of climate change. How is it that we respond to climate change also impacts the cost of doing so. If we want to address the underlying causes of climate change, industry, automobiles, human behavior, that is going to be very expensive. If we decide instead to address the damage caused by those issues, then it's going to be shockingly expensive. There's an old saying in industry, it's expensive to develop a green industry, it's overwhelmingly expensive to clean up from a dirty industry. Either way, the cost for both of these categories is rising exponentially. In November of 2021, the world's leaders arrived in Glasgow, Scotland, to discuss the next step to be taken to address climate change. This is a continuation of the law-developing process that happened in Paris in 2015, in Kyoto in 1997, and Rio in 1992. A global effort by nation-states to organize, create rules to address a common problem. In order for this to happen, there are some underlying requirements for global organization and law. First of all, you need nation-states or countries that interact with one another in what is we refer to as a system. Those interactions at some point will cause problems. They could be problems of communication, problems of trade, war, diplomacy, almost any sort of world politics problem. And when those nations agree that by creating rules or laws and organizations, they're going to try to solve those problems. In order for this to be successful, there must be an underlying consensus and commitment by those nation states to pursue the same path, share the expenses, and do so until the problem is solved. Not all efforts at international law and organization succeed. Not all efforts at law and organization fail. It really depends on the level of consensus and the commitment, especially of the major powers. One underlying reason that there is not consensus on climate change is because the impact varies greatly. And it really depends on the question that we ask. In this global map, the question is, what is the likely impact on GDP, or gross domestic product, over the course of the rest of this century? And as you can see by the color code, Russia, Western Europe, and Canada, countries in blue, will have the greatest decline in GDP, while the countries in red, Oceania, Africa, South Asia, South America, will have the least impact on their overall economy. The United States and China are somewhere in between. So the impact is felt further north. But if you change the question and say, what is the greatest impact on stability, even survival of a nation state as a result of climate change trends, we very quickly point to the island nations in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific. Beyond that, it's the countries largely in red that are least impacted economically, but they have the greatest impact on their state stability. And those people are going to be on the move. As a result, climate change does greatly impact migration. Global responses to climate change require American leadership. If we are to work together, it will require a credible United States leading the way, and it will require a consensus among the next 9 or 10 largest economies. An action plan would need to be developed. It would have to be codified into a binding accord, probably linked to something important like trade, Countries that violate this climate change agreement will lose access to markets, that sort of stipulation to give it teeth, and the rules would have to be applied blindly. Countries are either in compliance with this agreement or they are in violation. Let's look at the consensus or lack thereof among the major economies and polluters. Here we have the big four: the United States, Russia, China, India. They are the geopolitical giants on some levels. They are the major polluters on others. We add to those the middling powers and the small powers, and very quickly we realize there is no consensus on the way forward. China and India point to the United States and Western Europe, claiming you started this problem, give us a chance to develop while you make sacrifices today. Russia looks at China, India, and the United States and says, we're waiting for you three to take the lead, and then we're happy to follow suit, when in reality, not one of them really wants to make the move towards a better climate economy. In the United States, we are particularly deeply divided over climate change, and that is why the United States has minimal credibility as President Biden walks into Glasgow. That conference is taking place about a week after this lecture is filmed. If I had any confidence that Glasgow would result in a meaningfully binding accord that would change the direction of global responses to climate change, I would have delayed the filming of this lecture. U.S. leadership is not in the offing as well because we're deeply divided domestically. But if we were to take a lead, it would require something to happen on this graph. Here you see three levels of foreign policy challenges. Traditional high politics, those are military affairs like alliances, the onset of war, dealing with a major power like Russia, Japan, or China. Those are high politics issues. Our foreign policy leaders are thinking of them on a daily basis. On the highest level, existential, the sorts of challenges that fundamentally alter the trajectory of history, we have nuclear war, a global economic meltdown, or perhaps a global pandemic, the Spanish flu, or more recently, COVID-19. On the lower end, we have what are called low politics, second or third category of importance, promoting democracy abroad, dealing with middle and small powers of the world, and traditionally climate change. For the U.S. to take a leadership position on global climate change initiatives, we would need to turn that category yellow and then green, considering it as important as a global pandemic, an economic meltdown, or even nuclear war among nations. In the United States, there are times when we act in such a fashion. At least verbally, we communicate that climate change is extraordinarily important to us. There are some politicians who want to take immediate climate change action and others who are more interested in inaction. Generally speaking, Democrats favor climate change action. Republicans tend to be significantly more hesitant. And in the United States, the pendulum of power swings from one to the other, back and forth. Republicans in charge, Dems in charge, and back to Republican. It wasn't always this way, at least in terms of climate change discourse. Back in 2008, we had two candidates, Mr. Obama, who was deeply concerned with climate change, and Mr. McCain, the Republican, not quite on the same level of concern, but nonetheless argued that while he's not certain if climate change is the threat his opponent claims it is, why don't we assume so and take advantage of emerging green economies, market opportunities presented by the assumption that climate change is happening, it is linked to human behavior, and it will alter the trajectory of history. That was a very nice way for Mr. McCain to wade into the climate change waters. It was pretty meaningful debate in 2012. Mr. Obama, of course, up for re-election. Mitt Romney, the Republican challenger and candidate. Mitt Romney's a data guy. very, very bright, believes in data, and he follows the numbers. This concerned many on the hard right in the Republican Party because it is almost impossible to look at the sheer data and reach any conclusion that climate change is happening and happening very quickly, the implications of which will be devastating politically, economically, and militarily for the United States and other countries. By the time we get to 2016, any thin reed of consensus between the parties is completely gone. Mr. Trump rejected the idea that climate change was an authentic concern and claimed that he had never been a believer in global warming. If we look at our political spectrum from far left to far right, on one side we have a radical response to climate change that the US government probably cannot pull off. On the other end of the spectrum, another radical group claims that climate change is a hoax. In between are more moderate, more thoughtful, and more capable politicians. And yet to date, when they talk about climate change, it really is mostly empty talk. Look no further than what has happened to the Biden Build Back Better agenda, the massive spending plan that suddenly decided to revise climate spending aspects because one senator from the great state of West Virginia objected to it. How quickly the Biden White House was willing to sacrifice the green climate policy parts of that agenda. Let's look at the American public. Generally speaking, we fall into one of three categories. Category one would be Americans who believe climate change is happening and is happening because of human behavior. Category number two agrees climate change is happening and it is happening because of human behavior. These two appear to be in accord, and together they make up over 3/4 of Americans. Where they disagree is that the first group believes major sacrifices are required to address climate change, while the second group says only minor sacrifices are acceptable. The third category is people who say climate changes. It always has, it will. We should not be overly excited about it. Humans are not the cause of climate change, therefore no major change of policy and no sacrifice is required. Whether this is the first lecture you've ever seen on climate change or the 100th, it's going to be likely the first lecture you've ever seen on climate change that does not give you graphs of rising temperature, rising sea levels, images of floods, of droughts, of hurricanes, of forest fires, all associated with climate change. And the reason for that is I don't think it's going to have much of an impact. Americans, for the most part, are locked in to one of these three categories. And until we are all on the left-hand side of this chart, until the vast majority of Americans agree that not only is climate change happening and happening because of human behavior, but that major sacrifices are required, the U.S. cannot and will not be a global leader on the climate change agenda. We've now considered the impact of climate change, global efforts, and the United States. Our attention turns to U.S. foreign policy options. First, some assumptions. Number one, climate change is now a fully and highly partisan issue. People's position on climate change is largely determined by their political ID. The U.S. will not lead on the issue internationally. We did not have very much credibility in 2015 in Paris. In fact, it was embarrassing for our president to go looking through the halls and conference rooms in search of the Chinese leader to have a one-on-one meeting about climate change issues. Today, our credibility is even lower. President Biden is walking into Glasgow, a wounded first-year president. Thirdly, global efforts to resolve the climate change dilemma are doomed to fail. Lacking American leadership, very little consensus among the Big Ten, very little by way of global agreement on the direction to go or who should bear the cost of all of those expensive changes. And what that means is that we're largely left with unilateral U.S. foreign policy options. So what are those unilateral options? We can push job-creating green jobs. That would be the sort of policy that John McCain suggested all the way back in 2008. And to be fair, Mr. Obama's administration pursued for a good bit of his 2 terms in office. Green jobs are, of course, high-tech, so it doesn't mean just anyone can be trained for them and placed in those vocations, but they certainly are high-paying white-collar jobs, and for that reason, we could promote them. Number 2, we're going to have to be better prepared for migration trends. Because of climate change, Mexico is going to become unlivable in parts, not in the whole, but in parts. And that means that people from Central America, South America, and certainly Mexico are going to be moving northward into the United States. We've seen the basic trends in migration. Increasingly, people are claiming asylum the moment they cross the boundary, which gives them certain rights to be processed. And secondly, unaccompanied children are arriving, which is a very real challenge for both local and national law enforcement officials. We have to be better ready for the increase in migration likely to result from climate change. Thirdly, we can use trade policy to punish the major polluters of the world. It's not overly difficult to identify the industries with very large carbon footprints. We can provide a degree of sanction against them through our trade policy to send the message that it's in their economic interest to clean up their industries and their business practices. And finally, we should seriously consider shifting the focus of global efforts. Up until this point, whether it is Rio, Kyoto, Paris, Glasgow, or the next global conference, all of the focus has been on changing human behavior. And that's understandable. Human behavior is causing the climate to change. The climate change is causing ecological decline. And with that comes political instability, military insecurity, and economic cliffs that we could go over at any time. But this process simply isn't working for all the reasons I've explained in this lecture. So why don't we change the focus instead to new technologies that address the ecological decline, that mitigate the impact of climate change occurring? And if anyone can lead that battle, it would be the United States with our great research institutes and universities. So what sort of technologies are we talking about? They already exist in parts of the world. In Iceland, the Orca plant is like a giant vacuum cleaner, just sucking the CO2 emissions down and putting them away, never to be seen again. This lowers the impact of CO2 emission from industries and automobiles. Or here in South Florida, we're not planting palm trees any longer. For many people, palm trees are synonymous with South Florida. They're not native here. They arrived when a ship wrecked off the coast of Palm Beach County a few centuries ago. It was carrying coconuts northward to market. The coconuts came ashore, they grew into trees, the trees spread, and suddenly there are palm trees everywhere. But palm trees are not very good at absorbing CO2. So we've started planting other trees, ones that are more native to the region, equally beautiful, but more effective in combating climate change. At a time in world affairs when we are truly multipolar, where other powers are having a significant impact on global stability and well-being, and therefore have a stake in the resolution of those problems, there needs to be global consensus to move forward. Given the fact that global consensus cannot be found on climate change, we are very likely left only with those unilateral foreign policy options before us. Thank you as always for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, that was most interesting. And it was very, I think, clearly presented what the issues are and unfortunately what the limited options seem to be. But to lead us in exploring these very difficult issues of climate change, we have someone who's eminently qualified to do so, Don Brown. He is scholar in residence for sustainability, ethics, and law at Widener University. The director general of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, awarded the 2019 edition of the UNESCO Avicenna Prize for Ethics in Science to Professor Donald A. Brown. And it was a moment of pride, I think, for people in our entire region. Professor Brown, as I have told you before, is world renowned in environmental science and more specifically in the international climate change ethics movement. His book, Climate Change Ethics Navigating the Perfect Moral Storm, published in 2013, gives an influential analysis of why ethical principles have been neglected and how to include them in the climate change conversation. Because his optimistic spirit says that if we know it's morally wrong, maybe we won't do it, right? But he has sought to ensure that applied ethics is central to climate change policy development, both nationally and internationally. His compelling argument that limiting carbon emissions and mitigating climate change is the ethical imperative of our time, and it resonates widely in the current discourse on climate change. So, with that, I am now going to allow Professor Don Brown to hold forth and provide us his comments on this issue tonight.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to tell you briefly a little bit about myself and then tell you a couple of really important things that most people don't know about the science of climate change. I have been in the middle of this. I was at the Earth Summit in 1992. I gave a lecture there. I was a negotiator for the United States at the United Nations. I was standing at the microphone in 1997. The State Department asked me to moderate a debate about whether the whole world would agree that climate change is human caused, and all countries agreed. The evidence is that strong. But there are features of climate change that you got to get to understand the problem in more detail and the urgency of it. Let me see if I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to take about 10 or 15 minutes to cover issues that are not covered, but you really have to get. Okay, let's see. How do I move this forward?
Go up to slideshow, where
Okay.
it's at the top, click on slideshow. Keep
Okay.
going to the left.
Okay.
Once you click on slideshow, it'll show you a way to start from beginning.
Okay, slideshow on the.
Keep
Oh, I see.
going.
Okay.
Yeah, there, go there,
Okay.
and then go all the way to the left from
Okay.
beginning.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. And then you just click it.
Okay. So there are scientific features of this problem that are not like other environmental problems, and these features have profound implications for policy. Let me explain that. Greenhouse gases, every ton of greenhouse gases raises atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. They mix well. So that upper ring in the bathtub is the atmospheric concentration. Greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. 80% are taken out in 100 years, but 20% lasts for 1,000 years. Okay, so the policy implications of this is that every ton is responsible, no matter where in the world it's emitted, is responsible for harms around the world. So this is a line that shows you the atmospheric concentrations which are causing the existing harm. Atmospheric concentration of CO2 is about 419 parts per million, and the blue line is emissions. So every ton is responsible for the horrors that we're seeing around the world. Another thing is that we've known this with fairly high degrees of certainty, but it's been confirmed with most recent science for 30 years. And the United States has been often an obstructionist in international negotiations. I believe it's because even the environmental groups don't fully understand the policy implications of a problem like climate change. For 35 years, opponents of climate change have made two kinds of arguments. One is scientific uncertainty, and two, the cost to the US economy. But the United States already agreed in the treaty, in the precautionary principle, that this is the kind of problem you can't use. It's immoral to use some scientific uncertainty as an excuse. In the 1992 treaty, the United States agreed to something called the no harm principle, which says we can't use cost to us alone because we're killing other people. So an excuse that it will cost us something is not legally or morally relevant. Let me dive into other things you have to understand. What we're talking about is stopping a mass extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history that killed everything. And the goal of policy has implicitly, although not as explicitly stated, is to prevent another mass extinction. Mass extinctions, it was believed that if you could keep global increases in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, then you had some time before you created a mass extinction. So the Paris Agreement warming limit goals, the whole world agreed in Paris in 2015 that every country had an obligation to try to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but no more than 2 degrees Celsius. But the reason for that is if you don't do it, catastrophe is likely. And fortunately, we're starting to see some of the things that we're worried about. There are also tipping points in the climate system that will speed up the warming. There is the Greenland ice sheet, the Antarctic ice sheet, something called the Atlantic circulation patterns that will speed the warming up. So this is a problem unlike any other environmental problem. If you let it go too fast, it gets out of control. And even in the most recent negotiations, the international community believed that it could prevent the tipping points from tipping and preventing mass extinctions if we could keep the atmospheric concentrations low enough that would cause the tipping. This chart shows you there are 5 extinction periods that it killed 90% of life on Earth in terms of the Permian. The red dots on this chart are the atmospheric concentrations that carbon got up to, greenhouse gases got up to, which triggered these mass extinctions. And the reason why they kill everything is that temperatures get out of control. Temperatures we've already seen in Southern Asia this year, 125, 126 degree Fahrenheit in Pakistan and Southern India. And it was 130 degrees in temperatures are already approaching parts of the world which make it unlivable. And as the previous speaker said, it's starting to create mass migration. The Antarctic ice sheet is one of the positive feedbacks. The recent science says that we're beyond the point of stopping the Greenland ice sheet at the bottom from melting. The Antarctic ice sheet is also showing signs. The West Antarctic ice sheet is showing signs of melting. So just in the last 2 or 3 months, some of the tipping points are starting to tip. We're actually running out of time. Another tipping point is the Amazon rainforest. There is a huge amount of carbon in the trees. The Amazon's starting to die. The Amazon is getting close to being a tipping point that will make it a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. Now, the 80% of the carbon that is removed mostly by the trees. And so if we start to lose the major forests, everything speeds up. Another tipping point that we are seeing signs of being destabilized is the permafrost. There's huge amount of stored carbon in the permafrost, and the permafrost, particularly across the northern Russian border, is starting to melt. What I'm telling you is we're at a point in history where the scientific community is starting to freak out. We thought even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, if we could keep the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, we won't tip the tipping points, but the tipping points are starting to tip. If we melt West Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland, it's 186 feet of sea level rise. So all of a sudden, the sea level rises that were predicted as recently as 3 or 4 years ago seem to be not as stringent enough. The big ice sheets are starting to melt. And I want to talk a little bit about the migration. When I was with EPA, they sent me to the Army War College to do war games about parts of the world that would really suffer. In 1997, we did war games over Syria and Central America, where the Army War College predicted before it would happen that they would create millions of refugees. And it happened. The Army War College, not the Sierra Club, not the environmental groups, predicted huge amounts of refugees in parts of the world. They predicted Syria in 1997. A drought started in 2001. It lasted for about 5 or 6 years. It created 1 million refugees. Central America, the people showing up on the Texas border are leaving drought in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Why aren't we talking about that? Why do we approach the political problems with refugees on the Texas border as response to the drought in Central America? Bangladesh is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. This chart shows you, the middle chart shows you that at 1 meter of sea level rise, which is sort of a middle projection of where we're going, affects 15 million people, creates potentially 15 million refugees. A 1.5 sea level rise creates 18 million refugees. Different cities are incredibly vulnerable to sea rise, which looks like it's going to happen now. The small island developing states, several of them are already underwater. So Climate change is different than other air pollution or water pollution because our emissions hurt other people. That makes it a moral responsibility. We have a legal and moral responsibility. In Glasgow, the question, a big political question is who's going to pay for the harms. The harms are already in the billions of dollars. Under law, those who cause the problem have responsibility to pay for adaptation and for loss and damages. So in Glasgow, a lot of negotiation was focused in on creating financing mechanisms for the very, very likely suffering and harms that is going to be created. This is a chart of where we expect refugees to come from, mostly in Europe. These are already starting to happen. And so the 1992 treaty had a provision that said that all countries had a duty to not to create harm in other countries. The science is really strong that emissions coming from the United States are responsible for raising atmospheric concentrations. All greenhouse gases raise atmospheric concentrations around the world. So when we see people suffering, we've got to help people understand that it's our fault, it's our emissions. And the solution is to go to zero carbon in the next 3 or 4 decades. So the solution is the whole world must go to zero carbon. Now, after Paris, I came back and brought the 5 largest environmental groups to the law school. They didn't know the policy implications of the 1.5 degree and 2.0 degrees Celsius rule that every country agreed to. And I said to them, it means we've got to go to zero. And the environmental group said, we're not going to talk about it. I said, what? That's what the science requires. They said, we'll be treated as, they all use the same word in the law school. We will be treated as alarmists if we say we have to go to zero. And I said, so this actually puts a light on something else that is more causal in this situation than it is in other environmental problems. The misinformation, the disinformation campaign that was funded by fossil fuel industry has done enormous damage. I believe in free markets. I believe capitalism has a role, but you can't let the capitalist, Adam Smith said, capitalists will, they will plot against the common good. So what we've seen in this case is an amazing, sophisticated, highly financed effort to get people to not believe in the science, not understand the science, and it's despicable. What some fossil fuel companies have done and are still doing it. After negotiating, after being given the lead for the United States to get every country in the world agree that climate change was human caused, although it's reasonable to ask, how do you know that? Because the earth is going in and out of cycles because of natural forces. What is the evidence that it is human cause? I came back to the state of Pennsylvania and told the governor that the state would, everybody's got to play a role, not only national government, but state governments, because state governments have control over greenhouse gases, and so does local governments, by the way, that they need to work with the world to go to zero emissions. And the Republican governor said, okay, let's have a hearing. And he invited me to invite the coal industry and the natural gas industry to discuss setting up a hearing. We had a hearing on we told them that we wanted to have a hearing. We weren't asking them to commit to anything. And the fossil fuel industry representative said, if you even talk about this, we will cut your budget completely. That was on a Thursday. I go back into the office and I'm told by the Senate that the fossil fuel industry already arranged work with the Senate that they would cut our budget if we even talked about this problem. So I know it's controversial to try to blame someone, but if the best hope is, I believe, is to get people to see the injustice of what's happening. Sociologists actually argue that if you want social progress, you have to get people to see the injustice. Don't run away from it, but help people see it. Martin Luther King used to say, when you go across that bridge, don't run away from the cameras, but help the cameras see what's going on. So it's not only a justice issue, on getting people to understand the injustice of what we're doing to the rest of the world, I actually think is practically important. And I've discovered that people at the United Nations passionately believe that we have to get people to see the justice implications of this. Because at the international level, in the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, funding has been taken away from organizations and countries that work on environment and justice issues. There's a term they use is called neoliberal economic theory. And I'm amazed how much that has taken off. I'm also amazed when I went to Paris and spoke to leaders from Africa and Iran and countries that you wouldn't think would be interested in sort of Western ethics. They said, oh my God, that we've got to do that. What has happened? What happened to the United States? You used to be the leader, but now you're not. Using every program for the common good raises justice questions. You can't negotiate unless you face and work through justice issues. And so raising the justice issues, I've discovered, and I'm really surprised how many national leaders in 10 or 15 countries they put me in touch with. Getting people to see the justice is absolutely critical for a variety of reasons. One is this: the sociologists say that if people see the injustice, that will motivate them to join social action. These problems desperately need social action, and raising the justice dimensions of this is a tool, according to sociologists, to help generate energy for social action. And I'll just say one more thing. In Glasgow, they started to negotiate money for both for adaptation and also for loss, was something called loss and damages. The law requires countries that are causing the problem to pay for loss and damages. The United States, at the tip of the spear in the US government, was trying to avoid any responsibility for loss and damages. But in Glasgow, they're starting to negotiate that too. Okay, I'll stop there, but hopefully you can understand why I try to get you to see the differences in the science. The environmental groups, even the justice people, don't get the differences between air pollution and climate change, but those differences create these urgent justice issues, okay? Sorry for going on too long, Joyce.
Oh, no, that was riveting. I mean, you raised and you really brought it home, made some extraordinarily important points that and gave us a lot to talk about for right now. So why don't we get started? One of the first questions that I think is here that we really do need to address is from the slides you were showing. And that was startling to me, when we've had periods when the earth has basically been just wiped out, right? But the question that raises is, well, if this has happened before, when there weren't all of these automobiles and all of that going on, what doesn't that feed into the argument that this is just the natural thing that happens and there's nothing we can do about it?
Well, that's a reasonable question to ask. And I tell my students, yeah, ask that. Okay. Don't believe it because I said it, but the evidence is overwhelming that this is human caused. There are 13 we'll call fingerprints that we've known about, that the carbon dioxide goes halfway up in the atmosphere and creates a layer like a blanket. And the carbon dioxide in that blanket is fossil carbon, because the evidence is overwhelming that this is human caused, not natural caused. So
the rest were natural causes. Those other ones were things that no one could do anything about.
Yeah, well, yeah, the Earth has gone through a dozen or so hot, cold cycles, okay? And it's usually been caused by differences in radiation coming from Earth-Sun relationships. It's something called the Milankovitch. But they can measure, the scientists know what the output is. They know what is called the forcing. We've known since 1840 or 1860 what the forcing power of carbon dioxide is to absorb and radiate carbon. We know precisely when the Earth-Sun relationships change, what differences in terms of forcing power they do. So the evidence, when I saw the evidence, when I first understood it about 8 or 9 years ago, I said, this is incredibly over. That's why they sent me to negotiate with the Saudi Arabians over this, and they came around too. Okay, wow. Okay, and so there are 5 or 6 countries that also have large fossil fuel interests. They all have they agreed in 1997 that this is human caused. So I tell my students, continue to ask that question. It's a reasonable question to ask, but the evidence is freaking overwhelming that this is human caused. And that's why every country in the world agreed in 1997. Now, the fossil fuel industry was still pushing misinformation. I actually believe sociologists have done maybe 500 papers in peer-reviewed journals what the fossil fuel industry did to create and mobilize something that's called the disinformation campaign. When I saw what they did, given what's at stake, I said, this is so despicable. They hired people to undermine faith in science where none of the science they were relying upon was peer-reviewed. They hold fake conferences. They have fake books, okay? So the fact that Americans don't believe it is not an accident. It's all well documented by mostly the fossil fuel industry, not only in the United States, but also in Australia and Canada. The disinformation campaign was organized here, and that was taken all around the world. And people don't know how to deal with that, you know?
Right. So basically we've seen an unprecedented attack on science, not only with climate change, but with COVID. I mean, with the pandemic, we saw attacks on science, people saying they don't know what they're talking about and don't believe the science, or just not having credence. How do you how do you fight back with that, except with what you're doing right now? But it seems like it's so discouraging.
It's so discouraging, and it's difficult to engage the energy for people to see it, okay? Because they've already created there's a philosopher, Foucault, says the way power works, they create a narrative that is accepted and people are afraid to challenge it, okay? So it's despicable what they did. There's probably 400 or 500 peer-reviewed sociological papers about what they did, okay? And they hired people with the express goal of undermining faith in the mainstream science. They hired front groups and what are called astroturf groups. So this widespread social not lack of understanding that science is real is itself a big and important story.
Absolutely.
I believe.
And frankly, it's all because of greed.
Yeah. Well, Adam Smith, I'm not an opponent of private sector or free markets, but Adam Smith said, you better watch out. Members of the private sector will scheme against the common good. That's Adam Smith said that. Okay. And that's what's happened. Okay. No, the president of the Scandinavian countries said, we believe in the private sector, but we think that people have to decide what public goods, you know. So part of this, okay, so this all started in a big way, actually before Ronald Reagan was president. I was the lead lawyer for New Jersey, okay, and I saw the organized lying that was going on about overregulation. It just startled me, you know. So, but it's more sophisticated now. The people that hired and put together, you should go to my website if you're interested in more details. There's a large literature of what they did, how they did it.
Actually, we should write your website. So tell them what your website is so they can get more information.
ethicsandclimate.org.
Ethicsandclimate.org. Okay,
Yeah,
very
right.
good.
Okay, but so I tell my students, don't believe it because I say it. Okay, you got to work through whether I'm telling the truth or not. And the evidence on the disinformation is startling, and it's actually, I couldn't find a word for how awful and how immoral it was, given what's at stake.
Right.
And,
Well, let me get to a few more of these questions. One of them says, the speaker said not all programs succeed. When we look at Rio, Kyoto, Paris, and Glasgow, is there really any room for optimism that the world will do something serious to deal with climate change?
well, yeah, none of those. I was at all of those meetings.
Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, they were all disappointing, but they all made slight progress. Okay, so we've been making baby steps which you can build on. So in Paris, the whole world agreed to try to limit the warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. The hope, though, I think, is in getting people to see the deep injustice of what is going on. Our greenhouse gases are killing other people. It's not just us. It's not like air pollution, okay? We're running out of time before we tip all these tipping points. 5 of the 6 are starting to tip. I kept thinking in how awful the Ukraine thing is, but we're taking energy away. There is some growing sense that climate change is worse than we thought it was 2 years ago. You can see New York Times is reporting every day. People are starting to wake up to the trouble we're in, and I predict that will continue because the impacts will continue and the refugees will continue. The Army War College predicted this.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing.
Okay.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And they said in 1997, they said the mainstream science is sound.
Yeah.
The Army War College said also that Arab countries they're going to come after the United States. It will create hostility. Army War College studies, as part of what they do, events on the global stage are going to create instability and war. Okay, they have been right on top of this. Okay, and they predicted Syria. They predicted Central America. So.
Well, clearly, anyone with eyes can see what is going on now. With the erratic weather patterns. We know about the flooding in so many parts of the world. If you just really do the minimum amount of research, you can see the proof of what people have been saying.
I think you're right, and I think we're starting to see better response because of that.
Right.
But still, we have to go to zero carbon. Okay.
So as an individual, someone like me who has a normal American lifestyle, right? What does that mean for me as an individual? Does it mean I never turn up my heat? What does it really mean?
Well, as a number of people say, the most important thing is to try to change the laws. Okay, that's even
bigger
more
than
important.
just
Okay, so some people say just don't say you got an electric car. We need you in the game. Okay.
Got it.
Okay.
we need to pressure our lawmakers that
Right.
we take this seriously, so that they
Right.
can do the big changes that are
Right.
needed.
Yeah, we need big changes. We need legal changes, all the other stuff. You know, I don't fly without getting my flights offset. You know, I have uh, renewable energy, but that's the start of what I should do. I think if I feel an obligation to people that are already suffering, I believe I need to get politically engaged and encourage a conversation about it. Yeah,
Right. There was one thing that gave me a little bit of hope, and that was in the film. There was this machine or complex or something. It was in Norway or somewhere in Scandinavia
yeah,
that's cleaning up the
yeah,
environment. That's interesting. And then there's another question here that says, do you see reports that we can bury CO2 in the ocean
yeah,
realistic? So are there
yeah.
innovations that might solve this problem?
Yeah, the problem is that the discussion about that technology has been around for more than a decade. And when they've tried to implement it, they've run into practical problems. Okay. So when they got to burying the carbon, several of the Scandinavian countries couldn't keep the carbon in the ground because the geology was leaking. Okay. So I think the moral response is, yeah, push that, but that don't stop you from getting out of carbon combustion. Okay. Um, so keep the bigger political change that is needed in mind.
But what about that machine that cleaned the air? Does that really work? Is that something that should simply be spread around the world?
Well, it's not worked at scale yet. Okay.
Ah,
Okay.
okay.
So you can remove carbon from the stream. One of the questions is, what do you do with it? And there are several technologies, and they all have potential negative side effects. So there are tough policy questions, even if it works, how to implement it. There's something called geoengineering. There's a large literature, but I think the most informed people say, yeah, that might work, but don't count on it. Keep the carbon down. You know, there's no reason why we can't move to renewable energy quickly. Okay.
Right, right. Well, one final thing, because we're over our hour, but this has
Okay.
been so important. This is an important topic.
Right.
We have one final question that I do have is that some people are saying that what is happening now with the gas prices shooting up and all actually may help us get a grip on and start moving away from these fossil fuels. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought, did you see the movie Don't Look Up?
No, I didn't.
Oh, it's a great movie. It's
Okay,
absolutely wonderful.
I'll
It's
look at
about,
it this weekend.
okay, it's a comedy about why the politicians have not talked about this. Okay. And so we need to keep talking about having plans to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero as quickly as possible. And there are technologies that will get us there. But there are large economic interests. I work with people all around the world, including people in Australia and China and Canada. I'm an adjunct in China and Japan.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah. Australia and New Zealand. Okay. And I'm working with really good, thoughtful people about all of this. And they're all reporting the same frustration with their fossil energy controlling their politics.
Yeah.
So it's wherever the fossil fuel industry is big, the nations have been slow. Okay.
Right, right.
Okay.
Well,
Because
I mean, I think you've made the point that the real thing, even though the technology may be being developed and all of that to try to address this, the real thing is that we have to have the political will to do what is right.
we need in all governments a legal enforceable goal to go to zero. We need to get all governments to adopt a legally enforceable goal to go to zero carbon.
And so what, with our viewers here, as we sign, what would you tell them to do to help us
I would tell
that
them,
process?
okay, They could work at the state level. They could work at the city level. But I would tell them to connect with other groups that are working on the changing the law.
Mhm.
And there are really smart, active, thoughtful people that are engaged in this.
Well, with that, you've got your marching orders, dear audience.
Yeah.
Just you have to get
Yeah.
engaged. This is a question of
Yeah.
extinction. So
Yeah. It is a question of extinction. Okay.
yes.
It's already a question of massive suffering. Okay. Particularly in places like Bangladesh and small island states. Those Latin American countries. Just end with this. I knew that there would be mass suffering that would create refugees in 1998, and I went to certain African countries where I saw what drought was doing to people in Kenya and across the Sahel, and I was just like the ugliness of Ukraine. When you see what a person who can't feed themselves is going through, it's so sad,
Yeah.
And so we've got to help other people see what we're doing. We're already doing it to the world, So
I think it's very important, and I once again applaud you for helping us see that we
Yep.
are the problem. We are
Yep.
causing this
Yep.
global suffering,
Yeah.
and the sooner we can take charge of stopping the suffering, the
Right.
better for us all, for everyone.
Yeah,
So,
one slight minor disagreement I would have with the early presentation
mhm,
is because some people already don't think it's a real issue. That doesn't mean you don't try to get them to see it. Okay.
right,
Uh,
right.
One of my favorite philosophers, which it was Hannah Arendt. Do you know who Hannah Arendt is?
No, I don't think so.
It's a German. We have a duty to help people see the injustice that they're doing. Okay.
Yeah.
The world becomes just not because people are predisposed to it, but the world becomes just because other people help other people see the injustice. Okay.
Mhm, mhm.
So that's
So that's our other duty, to make sure that our friends and relatives and all realize what's going on, actually realize the
yeah.
role we each play. So
And what you're doing, try to get a wider public visibility on this problem. Try to put it higher in the public's agenda.
absolutely.
Okay.
Well, we stay with this. And again, once again, I want to thank you for taking
Okay.
time from your schedule to join us and to help educate our community. We're going to spread this word far and wide, and we will be issuing more invitations for you in the future to come and explain the continuing problem of climate change.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're doing. I know that you believe in international justice. I think that's what motivates you too.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. So we're in the struggle together.
yeah. And
Well,
what I've learned is that there are good people all around the world that
Yeah.
feel passionately too, in
absolutely.
places I would have never guessed it. Okay.
Yeah. And there's hope, because our young people definitely
Oh my God.
are much more enlightened about these things than we are.
My favorite speaker is what's the young girl's name? Greta Thunberg.
Yeah, Greta. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have been trying to get people to see the justice dimensions of this for 3 decades. Okay. And I've learned, and I know other people that have learned how to talk about it off of Greta.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
You've said that before, that she has a way of actually making it real and personal. So yeah.
yeah, she communicates the injustice of it all, the intolerable injustice of it. When she
Absolutely.
says, when she gives concrete examples of why it's unjust, and then she ends by saying, "How dare you?"
How dare you? That's a good way for us to end.
Right,
How dare
right,
you? The
okay,
intolerable injustice
right,
of climate change. So.
right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown, or Professor Brown. Thank you
Well,
so much for being with us. And I thank our audience. And of course, we thank the Frederickson Library. Jessica Nuponen is our contact there, and they are so supportive of our efforts to educate our community about these issues. So with that, I wish everyone a very, very pleasant evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.